The news of Robb Stark's will did not reach Jon Snow quickly, nor did it come gently. It arrived in a small leather pouch, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp and the cold, and it was delivered by a man he barely remembered from Winterfell, Tybalt, once a kennel hand, now ragged and half-starved from his journey. The letter had been entrusted to him in the confusion that followed Robb Stark's demise at the Twins. Tybalt had nearly perished crossing the rough terrain north of the Neck. He had traveled by night, sleeping in hidden dells, and more than once he narrowly avoided outlaws or worse. At Castle Black, exhausted and trembling, he finally pressed the documents into Jon's hands. He looked up at Jon with a bleakness in his eyes that made Jon's heart clench. Robb's personal sigil was sealed in wax on the parchment, and Jon felt dread coil in his belly. What final command did his brother leave him, if indeed he still had the right to call Robb his brother at all? Jon opened the pouch privately in his small solar, the one the watch now allowed him, a place where he conducted business as the newly elected Lord Commander. It was late, and darkness pressed against the walls. Ghost lay stretched near the glowing embers in the hearth, opening one crimson eye as Jon's tense fingers broke the seal. Jon's breath caught in his throat the moment he began to read. The words were plainly written, though the ink was blotched in places. It was Robb Stark's final decree, and it named Jon Snow as his true heir Jon, not Sansa or Arya or Bran or Rickon. The letter referenced witnesses, including the great Jon Umber and Meege Mormont. Most startling of all were the sentences. Henceforth, should it befall that Robb Stark, king in the north, dies without issue, let the rightful rule of the north and of all the domains it holds pass to my brother, Jon Snow, sworn brother of the Night's Watcher. No. His blood is Stark. By the gods, it is, and the north is his to lead. Jon finished reading, his mind numb. He had been raised with the iron truth that a man of the Night's Watch is sworn for life, that there was no turning back. And yet here was Robb, bestowing upon him a crown, or at least the symbol of one, more weighty than any vow Jon had ever taken. He wanted to weep. He wanted to tear the parchment into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to deny that it was real. But the wax seal bore the wolf's head, and the script was unquestionably Robb's. Slowly, he set it aside and dropped his head into his hands. The low flicker of candlelight threw shadows across the stone walls, making the space feel claustrophobic. Ghost let out a soft rumble that might have been a question or a concern. Outside the door, the footsteps of patrolling brothers echoed in the corridor, boots scraping the cold floor. The wind beyond the wall howled, a distant lament for the king in the north who had been slain in betrayal. Somewhere inside Jon's chest, a stirring began. An echo of duty he felt not to the watch, but to the family he had lost. He had never truly abandoned his siblings in his heart. Had he not come back from beyond the wall to warn the realm of danger, to hold to the values Ned Stark had instilled in him? This letter threatened to pull him in another direction, and he felt torn apart. All that night, Jon did not sleep. He read the parchment over and over until the words danced behind his eyes. Memories came unbidden. Of Robb teaching him how to wrestle in the muddy courtyard of Winterfell when they were boys, of them racing the other Stark children through fields of snow, of Robb's grin and the way he would tussle Jon's hair. Slowly, Jon began to remember the man behind the letter, the love they once shared as brothers. Sometime before dawn, he slumped forward, half awake, shoulders sagging beneath the weight of the truth. By the next morning, Tybalt had slept in the stables and was already being fed by the stewards, but word had spread that he had brought news for the Lord Commander. The Night's Watch was not a place for secrets, but at least no one knew the exact contents of the letter. Jon summoned Tybalt again, alone, to ask him about the will. Tybalt confirmed that it had been prepared in haste after the news of Lord Walder Frey's suspicions. Robb had sought to secure the inheritance of House Stark and the North in a manner that would not leave it in the hands of those who might betray them. The young king believed that Sansa was in the hands of the Lannisters, Arya was missing, Bran and Rickon were presumed dead, and so Jon Snow was the only option. "He spoke of you with a longing in his voice, my lord," Tybalt added in a hushed tone. "He said, 'Jon will never forsake the North. He is a Stark in all but name.'" Jon's chest tightened. each word cut deeper than the last. Guilt tore at him. He was bound by oath to the Night's Watch. His father taught him that the Watch's vow was for life, that no other ties could unbind it. In a world of broken promises, the Watch's oath was meant to be ironclad. Yet Robb's last request echoed in his mind as if the ghost of his brother whispered from the crypts of Winterfell, "You are my heir." The hours that followed were a haze of internal conflict. The weight of command pressed upon Jon from all sides. He had letters to write, wildlings to manage, rangers to send out. But each moment, the memory of that parchment called to him. A crown for the North. A crown that might bring them out of the subjugation of the Iron Throne. In the quiet after the day's tasks, Jon stared at his own reflection in the battered silver mirror by his bedside. He was not the boy who left Winterfell with dreams of honor. Life on the wall had hardened him. Sorrow had shaped him, and war had made him question everything. Days passed, and still he kept the secret. He never showed the document to Samwell Tarly or Maester Aemon, though both sensed something weighed heavily on him. He considered presenting it to the Watch's leadership council, but what would they say? How could they possibly reconcile it with their rules? Jon's sense of honor wrestled with the primal call of his blood. Each day he found a new reason to delay a decision. The chill winds threatened another wave of White Walkers. The realm was in chaos after the Red Wedding. The Lannisters held King's Landing, and the Boltons, traitors who had orchestrated the downfall of the Stark line, now claimed to rule the North. The cynic in Jon told him that to declare himself Robb's heir would be folly. But there was also something else in him, something that refused to let the name Stark vanish from the North. Each time he sat down to eat, he would find his appetite waning. Each time he closed his eyes to rest, he would see Robb's face, urging him to act. Eventually, the choice was made for him. A small band of northern free riders arrived at Castle Black, battered but determined. Among them was Lady Alyce Karstark, who had escaped her treacherous uncle's designs by fleeing to the Night's Watch. With her traveled a handful of men loyal to House Stark, grim and quiet, but resolute in their cause. They had heard rumors of Robb's last will and come seeking confirmation. Jon tried to deny them, to say there was no such thing. But Lady Alyce had eyes like flint, and she pressed him. She swore that if the will existed, the North would rally behind its rightful king. The Boltons were despised. The Lannisters were far away, enthroned in the South, distant from the hardships and loyalties of the North. If Jon Snow held the rightful claim, the hearts of many lords might turn to him, if only he would claim that birthright. Jon tried to remain stoic, but their fervor was contagious. The men who accompanied Lady Alyce insisted they would declare for Jon. Soon enough, he found he could no longer deny the truth. His vow to the Night's Watch was fracturing under the relentless tide of northern devotion. The confrontation came quietly that evening in the mess hall. Lady Alyce and her men refused to leave unless Jon revealed whether the rumored will existed. Across the table, Ed Tollett and a few other brothers looked uncomfortable, yet they could not fail to notice the tension mounting. Alyce went to her knees and begged him to consider the North. Jon's heart pounded in his ears. This was blasphemy in the eyes of the Watch. Once a man took the Black, his ties to his old life were severed. Yet here knelt a lady of the North, a Karstark no less, pleading for him to stand as king. The hush in the hall was palpable. Even the torches seemed to hiss in disapproval. Jon drew in a long breath and told her to rise. "My lady," he said quietly, his eyes flicking over her and the men behind her. "Do you know what you ask? You place me at odds with my vows. You would tear me from my duty." Her words were gentle but firm. "You were born a Stark at heart, Jon Snow, and now the North needs you. How many betrayals must we suffer? You have seen what the Boltons have done. You have seen how the realm has turned from our cause. If we do not stand behind the king your brother named, what future do we have?" Jon did not speak. The hush deepened. Slowly, he turned and left the hall, unable to endure the raw desperation in her voice. He paced the yard, the cold biting his cheeks. Ghost followed, silent as a shadow. Stars glittered overhead. When he was certain no one else was near, Jon allowed himself to break. He gasped for breath as if drowning, the weight of 1,000 decisions pressing upon him. To remain Lord Commander might save him from condemnation but would doom the North to the rule of the Boltons and the Lannisters. He thought of the thousands slaughtered at the Red Wedding, of the treachery that ended Robb's life and Lady Catelyn's. He remembered his father's unwavering sense of honor. Ned Stark would have found a path that served the realm and remained true to his conscience. But Ned Stark had been beheaded for his honor. Jon was no fool. He knew that crowning himself could lead to war, a war he might not win. Yet he also thought of the White Walkers, the threat beyond the wall, the threat that demanded unity and leadership. Would the Boltons or the Lannisters ever truly stand with him against the undead? The North needed a rallying cry, and if nothing else, the Starks could be that cry. It was Maester Aemon, ancient and wise, who found him alone in the yard. He laid a trembling hand on Jon's shoulder. "You have the blood of the dragon," the old man whispered, alluding to rumors about Jon's parentage that he had sometimes hinted at. "But your heart is Stark. I see your torment." Jon looked at him, a question in his dark eyes. Maester Aemon only smiled faintly. "What is duty against the call of love? Family or vows? How do we choose? I had the chance to be king long ago and I refused. Yet you, perhaps, have a different path before you. One that might change the course of history." Those words resonated in Jon's mind for days. He tried to perform his duties as usual, mustering rangers, meeting wildling envoys, distributing supplies. But the tension in Castle Black grew. Some of the Black brothers heard rumors swirling that Jon was heir to Winterfell, that he was named in Robb Stark's will. Others thought it was a ploy by Northern loyalists to break the Watch's neutrality. Ser Alliser Thorne, having returned from an expedition, sensed the undercurrent of discontent and took every opportunity to sow doubt about Jon's leadership. "He puts the realm at risk for a crown he cannot wear," Alliser snarled to his loyalists. "The man is a traitor in the making." Thorne's words spread like wildfire, and soon, even men who respected Jon began to question his loyalties. Matters came to a head when a raven arrived from the Dreadfort. Ramsay Bolton's signature was on the letter. He demanded that the Night's Watch return any fugitives from the north who might be sheltering there, including Alice Karstark. The note threatened retaliation if they refused. It concluded with a chilling line: "Send the woman back, or your precious black walls will learn what it means to face true torment." Jon read the letter aloud to his senior officers. Some of them wanted to capitulate to maintain neutrality, but many more balked at the cruelty. Jon, for his part, stood stone-faced. Even as a child, the name Bolton had stirred fear. He thought of all those who had served House Bolton blindly. He looked around at the Night's Watchmen. "The Watch takes no part in the quarrels of the realm," he repeated, but his voice sounded hollow. He saw in their eyes the echoes of his father's words, that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The man who stands by as innocents are slaughtered is also guilty. With the Boltons in control, the North would drown in blood. That night, Jon called a private meeting in his solar with the staunchest of his supporters in the Watch. Men like Dolorous Ed, Gren, PYP, those who lived still, and Samwell Tarly. He told them everything. About the will, about the band of Northerners who had come seeking a true Stark king, about his torment. He braced for their condemnation. Sam was the first to speak. "The realm needs men like you, Jon," he said simply, voice trembling. "We made vows, but the realm is bigger than our vows. The White Walkers won't care who sits in Winterfell or King's Landing, but the men who lead the realm might. If you were king in the north, perhaps you could unite them. Or at least you could protect our people from the threat that's coming." Ed was next, sighing dolefully. "I never thought I'd see the day we had a king up here, let alone you, Jon. But if you ask my opinion, better a Stark in Winterfell than a flayed man." A wave of subdued laughter went around the room, but the tension remained thick. Jon looked down. "I'd be abandoning you," he said. "The Watch, my brothers." Sam shook his head. "We would still be your brothers. The only difference is, your duty might be larger now. Larger than the wall alone." You don't have to abandon us. You might even gather more support to help defend the realm from the others. Don't forget the Watch's resources could still be used if you are recognized as a legitimate power in the north. They debated late into the night. Jon insisted on hearing every objection, every concern. PYP feared that if Jon left, the Watch would collapse or turn on itself in a civil war. Gren pointed out that many men who came to the Wall wanted nothing to do with lords and kings. Ed worried about the scorn they would face from other sworn brothers. But each protest was met by Sam's quiet optimism, that this was an opportunity to break the cycle of inaction, that perhaps this was the way the Watch could truly serve the realm, by supporting Jon as king in the north to fight the real threat. Jon hardly slept. By dawn, he drafted a letter. His hand trembled as he wrote. In it, he announced to the major northern houses that Robb Stark had named him as heir, that he could no longer ignore his brother's last will, and that he would step forth to claim the mantle of the king in the north. He did not sign it Lord Commander, but simply Jon Snow of the blood of House Stark. That very morning, he sent out the ravens. When the last bird vanished into the icy sky, Jon looked up at the wall, shimmering under the pale sunlight. The weight in his heart felt at once unbearable and strangely exhilarating. Ghost brushed up against his legs, and Jon reached down to run his fingers through the direwolf's fur. For Robb, he whispered. For father. For the north. The fallout was immediate. Many of the senior officers of the Watch demanded Jon's resignation as Lord Commander, calling him an oathbreaker. Ser Alliser Thorne led a group of Black brothers who outright called for Jon's head, insisting that the Watch could not stand by a man who would crown himself. Fighting almost broke out in the yard when the men loyal to Jon, Rangers he'd led beyond the wall, stewards he'd treated fairly, wildlings who admired his courage, refused to let Thorne's faction seize him. In the end, Maester Aemon and Sam managed to calm the confrontation, reminding everyone of the greater threat. But the rift was evident. The Watch was on the brink of tearing itself apart. Jon, his face grim, removed the cloak of Lord Commander and passed the office to Bowen Marsh, who received it with trembling hands. Marsh's expression was a tortured one, for he knew the severity of the moment. Jon stepped down, not out of cowardice, but out of respect for the Watch's neutrality. He would no longer drag them into a war they did not sign up for. He addressed the men gathered in the courtyard. I came here as a boy, seeking a place in this world. I found my brothers and I found purpose. I am grateful to all of you, but now, a duty calls me that I cannot ignore. I have been named to lead the North, and if I do not, there will be no one left to remember our oaths or our names. Forgive me, or do not. I must go. With that, Jon donned his old Stark leathers. He buckled Longclaw at his side. A handful of men, black cloaks billowing, stepped forward to follow him. Some parted ways entirely. Some hesitated. Tormund Giantsbane, the wildling leader who had come to respect Jon, merely nodded and said, "The crow's no crow no more. He's a wolf, He offered to accompany Jon, half jesting that a wildling entourage was exactly what the new king in the north needed to show he was a man of the people. Jon only smiled wearily and accepted Tormund's help. Lady Alice Karstark and her small party stood outside the gates, their horses saddled. When Jon emerged, they hailed him. They knelt in the snow, heads bowed. It felt strange and wrong to Jon, but he understood the meaning. Before them stood the man they believed would save them from House Bolton's cruelty and restore the true line of Stark. They rode south, the bitter wind lashing at their faces. Snow drifted from the sky in swirling curtains. Behind them, the wall's colossal height dwindled in the distance, and Jon felt a pang of nostalgia and worry. Had he done the right thing? There would be no turning back. The moment he left Castle Black, he ceased to be Lord Commander. Now he was something else entirely, a king in the making. Could the North rally behind a bastard of Ned Stark? Robb's decree might grant legitimacy in the eyes of some, but others would likely scorn him as an oathbreaker or worse. Yet every time doubt gnawed at him, he remembered the letter naming him heir, the final prayer of a dead brother. He remembered the gloom in the eyes of northern men who had lost everything. He rode on, letting the snow lash at his cheeks, steeling himself for the battles to come. Their first stop was the last hearth, seat of the Umbers. The keep was half buried in snow, the towers standing grim and solitary against the gray sky. Word of Jon's departure from the watch had outpaced him, and they arrived to find the gates opened, the courtyard torchlit. A small retinue led by the great Jon's cousin, Mors Umber, greeted him with an uncertain welcome. The great Jon himself had been taken by the frays, or so rumor said. Mors's thick beard was flecked with ice, and his breath steamed in the cold. He wore a battered cloak of bear fur, and his voice was rough as granite. "So it's true, is it? Robb named you." He eyed Jon up and down, assessing him. "That's a heavy mantle to place on a bastard's shoulders." Jon met his gaze without flinching. "Robb was my brother in all but name. If he named me, it was no whim." Mors studied him a moment longer, then broke into a crooked grin. "Well, we Umbers aren't known for bending easily, especially not after the Red Wedding. But I served alongside your brother. I saw him fight, and if you carry that spirit, I'll stand behind you. But by the gods, I want to see you tear the Boltons apart for what they did." Jon exhaled slowly, grateful for the acceptance, even if it came with savage expectations. He responded with a solemn nod. "They will pay for their treachery." Within the hall, food was shared, bread and salt given, and a measure of trust established. Mors demanded to see the letter bearing Robb's seal. Jon produced it, letting the older man trace the signature and the mark of the direwolf. The tension in Mors's face softened, replaced by a fierce determination. "Then we'll gather our men. We'll call the banners that still remember the Stark name." And so it began. Letters were dispatched from the last hearth to what felt like every corner of the north. Some houses replied with immediate pledges of support, fueled by hatred for the Boltons. Others hesitated, wary of defying a family that the Iron Throne now recognized as the Wardens of the North. Jon found himself learning the intricacies of northern politics more quickly than he ever wished. He met with clan leaders from the mountains near the stony shore, haggled with sworn swords who demanded assurances. The days turned into weeks, and more men arrived, drawn by the rumor that a new Stark king had arisen. Some came from as far as White Harbor, carrying news that the Manderleys, old allies of the Starks, were chafing under Bolton's rule. Quietly, more ravens arrived from hidden allies, promising men and resources once open conflict began. Yet not everyone was pleased. The Boltons were no fools. A letter arrived from Roose Bolton himself, and it was as cold and cruel as the man's reputation suggested. He acknowledged the existence of Robb's will but denounced it as invalid because Jon Snow was a bastard and a deserter from the Night's Watch. "You name yourself king in the north, but you are only a pretender. My house has been named Wardens of the North by the Iron Throne, and the Dreadfort does not bend to trifling illusions. Winterfell is ours by right of conquest, and we will not yield it." The letter ended with a veiled threat, stating that if Jon continued this folly, House Bolton would snuff out every last spark of rebellion. Jon stared at the parchment, recalling the sickening feeling he'd had when reading Ramsay's letter at Castle Black. There was nothing in Bolton's words but intimidation and cunning. He had no illusions about facing House Bolton. They had numbers and they held Winterfell, the seat of power. But Jon's fear was eclipsed by the sense of righteous anger burning inside him. For each lord that bent to Bolton's rule out of fear, Jon resolved to give them a reason to hope. If they saw that a true Stark could rally the North, they might turn. Yet the burden of leadership weighed heavily. Every strategy session with Mors Umber, with Lady Alice, with Tormund, reminded Jon of how untested he was in large-scale warfare. He had fought wildlings, he had fought others, but commanding an army against a cunning lord like Roose Bolton was a different matter. The nights were long, spent poring over maps of the North, analyzing supply routes, fortress placements, and potential allied houses. Winter was pressing in with greater ferocity. Snowdrifts piled high against keep walls, roads vanished under sheets of ice, and the threat of blizzards could trap armies for weeks. But with the approach of true winter, Jon sensed that time was against them in another sense. Beyond the wall, the others would be gathering strength. He could only pray that those who remained in the watch would hold them off. Perhaps if Jon succeeded quickly in uniting the North, he could spare men to reinforce the wall. That was the only comfort he could find to assuage the guilt of leaving the watch behind. Even so, guilt gnawed at him. Each day he woke, uncertain if he had chosen correctly. Each night he lay down, hearing Robb's voice in his dreams, urging him to protect their home. Word spread that the new king in the north had set up a war camp at the last hearth, so traveling in the region became dangerous. Bolton patrols roamed the countryside to snuff out loyalists. More than once, skirmishes erupted between Jon's gathering forces and Bolton outriders. The first time Jon led a sortie, he felt an unexpected surge of familiarity. It was not so different from leading a scouting party beyond the wall. The men who followed him needed reassurance, direction, and bravery. Jon gave what he could, guiding them with a firm hand. The clash was quick and brutal. Bolton men tried to ambush them, but Ghost's keen senses alerted Jon's group. The ensuing fight left half the ambushers dead or wounded. When Jon returned to camp, his sword sticky with blood, he felt no triumph, only a grim acceptance that war had truly begun. Over the weeks, more houses declared. House Glover, stung by the betrayal of the Freys, promised 200 men. House Serwyn, devastated by the Boltons, offered what little they could muster. Some smaller houses, like the Flints and Norreys, expressed support in their quiet ways. But the bulk of the North was still in question. White Harbor would be a prize, but Lord Wyman Manderley was rumored to be playing a dangerous game with the Lannisters. Jon recognized that if he could secure White Harbor's loyalty, the tide might shift decisively. But to do that, he might need to wrest Winterfell from the Boltons or at least strike a blow that showed the North the Starks were truly back. In the darkest hours of a frigid night, Jon made his choice. They would march on Winterfell. It was a calculated risk, charging the seat of northern power in deep winter, with less than half the North pledged, bordered on madness. But if they waited, the Boltons would only grow stronger, reinforcing their grip. If they moved swiftly, perhaps they could surprise them, rally other houses along the way, and retake the ancestral castle of House Stark. Once Winterfell was in Jon's hands, doubters might be convinced to join. War horns sounded in the courtyard of the last hearth. Men stirred, gathering gear and provisions. Horses were saddled, wagons loaded with whatever meager supplies they had. The beating of drums cut through the still air. Snow fell in thick flakes, as if the sky sought to smother all noise. Amid the bustle, Jon walked among the men, offering quiet encouragement, checking harnesses, ensuring each group had enough food to last. His presence steadied them. Some called him Your Grace or King Jon, and it still made him uncomfortable. He was no king, he thought, just a bastard trying to hold a fractured realm together. But he did not correct them. The North needed a king, not a humble boy in black robes. They set out at dawn, columns of men trudging through knee-deep snow, the Umbers leading one flank, Karstark loyalists another, a contingent of wildlings under Tormund in the rear. The sight was both grand and grim. Tattered banners of the dire wolf whipped in the wind, the first time they had flown in open defiance since Robb's death. Jon rode near the front, Longclaw sheathed at his side, Ghost loping silently. The roads were treacherous, but they pressed on, sustained by the dream of reclaiming Winterfell. Any time doubt crept into Jon's heart, he remembered how the old halls used to echo with laughter. He pictured a young Sansa singing her songs, Arya racing through the corridors, Bran climbing the walls, Rickon chasing Shaggy Dog. He thought of the yard where he and Robb had sparred. Winterfell was more than a castle. It was the soul of the Starks. To see it defiled by Bolton rule was an insult to everything Ned Stark stood for. Their progress was slow. Storms harried them. The men took shelter in abandoned barns or in the halls of petty lords who dared to offer them warmth. More than once, they found villagers who had been terrorized by Bolton soldiers seeking to hamper Jon's march. In those villages, men and boys volunteered to fight for the new king. With each new addition, the column swelled. The days bled into each other, a haze of frigid breath, damp furs, and rumbling stomachs. They had not the luxury of waiting for better weather. Winter had truly come, and it weighed on them all. Finally, they reached the outskirts of Winterfell's domain. The old watchtowers were in disrepair. Roose Bolton had not wasted resources repairing them, so the fortress's defense primarily rested on the thick walls and the small garrison inside. Jon's scouts reported that Bolton had left Ramsay in command of the castle with a sizable force, though not as large as one might fear. Roose himself was said to be dealing with matters in the south, possibly coordinating with the Iron Throne. This could be the opening Jon needed. Yet the Bolton forces remained formidable. They had siege weapons, vantage points, and the advantage of a castle that was difficult to storm, especially in winter. A direct assault would be costly, and they had word that the Freys might be sending reinforcements, though it was unclear if or when they would arrive. Jon convened a war council in a snow-laden grove to discuss how best to proceed. The Umbers argued for a head-on attack, trusting in the fury of the north to overwhelm the defenses. Others, like Alice Karstark, cautioned patience, suggesting a feigned siege to draw the Boltons out. Tormund insisted they find cunning ways to scale or breach the walls at night. But cunning plans or not, a siege in winter was lethal. Their supplies were limited. If they waited too long, men would starve or freeze. The only advantage was that the Boltons inside Winterfell might also be hard-pressed by the season. Jon wrestled with these options. He paced around the grove, arms folded. A cold wind rattled the naked branches overhead, sending clumps of snow tumbling down. He could hear the hiss of his men's breath in the frosty air as they watched him. War was no simple puzzle. Each choice could lead to hundreds, thousands of deaths. Finally, Jon spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "We have no time for a long siege. If we wait for spring, we'll be undone. We strike within the week. Under cover of darkness, we'll deploy men to secure the gate and the postern. Once inside, we open the gates from within and let the main force enter. If the Boltons come out to meet us in the field, we face them head-on. The longer we delay, the more likely Frey reinforcements or others will arrive to bolster them." The lords present exchanged glances. Some found the plan risky. Others nodded, a grim acceptance in their eyes. It was decided. Scouts went out that evening to pinpoint weaknesses in the walls, guard rotations, where the old tunnels lay. Winterfell had hidden passages, some known only to the Starks. Jon remembered them dimly from childhood tales. With luck, one might allow them entry or at least position them advantageously. But each hour that passed increased the likelihood the Boltons would realize the threat, so speed was essential. The night of the assault arrived swift and moonless. Jon had scarcely eaten all day. His stomach churned with anticipation. Men wrapped their boots in rags to muffle sound, and the wildlings were especially adept at moving silently in snow. Torches were kept low or extinguished. The wind whipped at their cloaks, half smothering their presence. Jon moved at the head of the group, accompanied by a small band of archers and swordsmen. Mors Umber to his left, Tormund to his right. Ghost padded ahead, spectral in the darkness. The plan was straightforward. Sneak close, dispatch any perimeter guards quietly, find entry through a sally port or the damaged section of wall rumored to still be under repair, then open the main gate. Meanwhile, a second contingent under Alice Karstark would wait in the treeline, ready to storm forward once the gates were open. They reached the outer walls, a stretch of stone battered by time and incomplete repairs. 2 Bolton guards stood watch by a narrow opening. Jon motioned to his men. Arrows hissed through the air. Both guards slumped silently into the snow. The group advanced, hearts pounding. The opening had been covered by makeshift wooden planks. The men pried them loose, the wood groaning softly but thankfully not loud enough to rouse the entire garrison. One by one, they slipped inside, a ragged line of determined faces. Within the courtyard, torches lit the walls, revealing patrols of Bolton men. The group split, some taking positions behind pillars and shadowed corners, others following Jon across the yard toward the main gate's mechanism. The next moments were a blur. A Bolton sentry turned a corner, saw them, and shouted. Tormund, quick as a cat, threw an axe that buried itself in the man's neck. But the alarm was sounded nonetheless, and the courtyard erupted in chaos. Bolton soldiers ran from the barracks, half-dressed, grabbing weapons. The clang of steel rang out in the night, and men howled war cries that ricocheted off the stone walls. Jon fought through the confusion, slashing left and right with long claw, the Valyrian steel singing in the frosty air. Blood spattered on the snow, turning it a dark crimson. Ghost leapt at throats, swift and savage. Mors Umber bellowed commands to his men, leading a push to secure the gatehouse. A handful of Bolton archers managed to scramble onto the walls, loosing arrows down into the courtyard, forcing Jon's men to scatter for cover. The entire castle seemed to convulse with violence. Jon found himself locked in a furious duel with a Bolton man who wielded a heavy mace. The man swung wildly, forcing Jon back with each blow that crunched the stone floor. In a desperate counter, Jon stepped inside the swing, ramming Longclaw up under the soldier's ribcage. The man's eyes went wide as he collapsed. Jon wrenched the sword free. He remembered Ygritte's words about how killing a man felt. There was no glory in it, only the savage necessity. He pushed that thought aside and pressed on. Above, the gate mechanism loomed. They needed to raise it. If the gates opened, Alice Karstark's force would pour in. But a line of Bolton men had scrambled to defend the controls. Nearby, Tormund had already begun hacking his way toward them, roaring with each swing of his axe. Jon joined the charge, slashing and dodging. Their combined fury broke the defenders, who stumbled back from the onslaught. Swiftly, Mors Umber and a handful of others cranked the mechanism. The gates groaned, rising inch by inch. Outside, a war horn echoed. Jon's heart soared. On the other side of the gate, he could see torchlight flickering. Within moments, Karstark men poured into the courtyard, adding their blades to the melee. The Bolton forces were caught between two prongs. Some tried to flee deeper into the keep. Others fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Ramsay Bolton, nowhere in sight, was likely organizing a defense or preparing a counterattack. Winterfell erupted with noise. The clash of metal on metal, the screams of the wounded, the bellowed orders. It all melded into a storm of brutality. Jon fought through it, his breath ragged, arms aching. He saw the bodies of men he knew, scattered across the stones. A wave of regret and horror coursed through him, but there was no time to mourn. The momentum was with them. They had to press on, clear the courtyard, secure the walls. At one point, Jon glimpsed the storied weirwood of Winterfell's godswood, its ancient white bark shimmering in the night, as if the old gods themselves watched the carnage in silent reproach. Gradually, the Bolton resistance broke apart. Groups of defenders threw down their arms or tried to hide in corridors. The gloom within the great hall was filled with echoes of steel and frantic shouts. Jon, Tormund, and Mors pushed forward, searching for Ramsay. They found him in the main hall, flanked by a cluster of loyal retainers. Ramsay wore leather armor adorned with the flayed man's sigil. Blood smeared across his mouth as if he had tasted raw violence. A twisted smile stretched his lips. Jon felt a cold wave of disgust. Here was the man who had terrorized the North, who had hunted helpless victims for sport, who had gloated about slaying innocents. Now he stood, brandishing a sword, unafraid, that manic gleam in his eyes. Jon's men fanned out, cautious. Ramsay sized them up and spat on the floor. So the bastard of Ned Stark pretends to be king? You come to claim your father's castle. Snow? I'll send your head to your precious crows at the wall. He let out a mad laugh. But first, maybe I'll cut that pretty face off and feed it to my hounds. Jon stared at him, rage simmering. You've broken faith with the North, he said quietly, raising Longclaw. You betrayed my brother. You murdered innocents. No more. Ramsay only shrugged, an air of twisted excitement about him. Words, words, words. Let's see what you're made of, then. And without further parley, he lunged at Jon, sword hissing through the air. Their blades crashed together, sparks dancing. Tormund lunged in, but Ramsay's men attacked to protect their master, forcing Tormund into another duel. The hall exploded with violence once more. Ramsay's skill was not to be underestimated. He fought with an unorthodox ferocity, aiming savage cuts at Jon's torso and legs, forcing him to dodge and parry. But Jon had the advantage of Valyrian steel, and the memory of every lesson he learned from Ser Roderick Castle, from Corran Halfhand, from the hard-home battles. Slowly, he pressed Ramsay back, each blow driving the man closer to the far wall. Ramsay's grin twisted into a snarl, and he unleashed a flurry of strikes that Jon barely managed to fend off. One sliced across Jon's upper arm, drawing blood. Pain flared, but Jon gritted his teeth, focusing. He feinted high, then swung low, catching Ramsay across the thigh. Ramsay hissed, stumbling. Behind them, the fighting raged on, but Jon could hear the screams of Bolton men dying or surrendering. The hall was littered with bodies. Ramsay's time was running out. Jon pressed the advantage, unleashing a savage overhead strike. Ramsay blocked, but the force of Longclaw knocked his sword from his hand. The clang of steel on stone echoed. Ramsay fell to his knees, blood streaming from his thigh. He looked up at Jon with hate-filled eyes. "Go on," he spat. "Kill me. You're the good Stark, aren't you? Show the world your mercy, or show them you're just like me." Jon stared down at this broken creature. He recalled the nightmares Ramsay had inflicted on so many. The desire to end him here, to put a blade through his throat, was overwhelming. But a memory of Ned Stark flickered in Jon's mind, the memory of how a just man deals with a criminal. "You're no better than him if you kill him in cold blood," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. But another voice retorted, "He deserves no mercy. He is a rabid beast." In the end, Jon made his choice. "Your crimes won't go unanswered," he said, voice hoarse. He raised Longclaw in both hands. "By the laws of the North, you are sentenced to die." And he brought the blade down with swift finality. Ramsay's eyes widened. Then there was only a lifeless stare. Blood pooled around him. Silence seemed to cloak the hall. The last vestiges of battle echoed from distant corridors. But here, in the great hall of Winterfell, it was done. The flayed man had fallen. A strange hush settled over the castle as the final pockets of resistance were crushed or surrendered. Jon's men and allies drifted into the courtyard, bearing torches that flickered against the ancient stone. Some were wounded, many had fallen, and the survivors stared in exhaustion at one another. The night sky above was a tapestry of stars, cold and unfeeling. Jon felt the ache in his arm, the cut still bleed. "Engie." Tormund approached, panting, a smear of blood across his cheek. "It's done," he said, voice rough. "The flayed man is gone. The wolf stands." Jon managed a nod. Ghost padded up, pressing his muzzle against Jon's side. Mors Umber stepped forward, followed by Lady Alice Karstark, their eyes filled with awe and relief. Then, as one, they knelt in the bloody snow before Jon, heads bowed. One by one, other men, battered and weary, sank to their knees as well. Jon stood among them, the wind snatching at his hair. He saw their faces lit by torchlight, some with tears, some with fierce pride. They were hailing him as king. Jon felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Triumph, sorrow for the dead, relief that Winterfell had been reclaimed, dread for what lay ahead. This was a victory, but the war was far from over. The Iron Throne would not accept this easily. Roose Bolton might still be a threat. The Freys, the Lannisters, they would challenge his claim. And beyond the wall, the White Walkers gathered, an ancient enemy that cared nothing for crowns. But for this moment, at least, the North had a Stark again. He sheathed Longclaw and looked around at the men kneeling. He felt unworthy of their devotion, yet he knew he must accept it. "Rise," Jon commanded quietly. "Rise, my lords, my friends. Winterfell is yours again. It belongs to all of us who would protect the North." They rose, weariness and hope mingling in their expressions. Some began to cheer, softly at first, then louder, a ragged cry that grew into a thunderous roar, echoing off the walls. "The king in the north!" they shouted. "The king in the north!" John stood in the center of that storm of voices, his breath visible in the cold air, the taste of ash and iron on his tongue. Felt unreal, like some dream he might wake from. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Robb's will, saw his brother's face smiling sadly. "You are my heir, John," he seemed to say. "Lead them, defend them. Stand as a Stark, and do not let the North fade into darkness." John opened his eyes. He was king in the North now, and the burden of that title was immeasurable. He thought of the dangers to come, the inevitable clash with the Iron Throne, the uncertain loyalties of some northern lords, the unstoppable approach of winter and the horrors it would bring. Yet he also thought of the Night's Watch, how this victory might mean he could better fortify the wall, rally the realm. He remembered Sam's words, that perhaps as king, he could do more to save them all. He clung to that hope. Winterfell's courtyard gradually quieted as the men set about tending to the wounded and securing the halls. Fires were stoked in the great hearth to chase away the chill. John walked the corridors with Ghost at his side, reacquainting himself with the castle of his childhood, though so much had changed. Hallways seemed darker, corners more foreboding. He passed by the old library, remembering hours spent there with Robb and Bran, exploring dusty tomes about knights and monsters. He passed the corridor leading to the crypts. He paused, heart heavy. He owed a visit to Ned Stark's tomb and to the memory of Robb. But not now. He did not have the strength yet to face those echoes of the past. Instead, he moved to the Great Hall, where the captured Bolton men were being assembled, along with the few surviving lords who had thrown their lot in with Ramsay. John regarded them with stern eyes, announcing that House Bolton's tyranny was ended, that those who bent the knee to House Stark might be spared, if their crimes were not too great. A few tried to protest, claiming fear of Bolton reprisals was the reason they had served. John was in no mood for excuses, but he also recognized the necessity of mercy to rebuild the North. Thus he judged each man by his deeds, advised by Mors Umber and others who knew the extent of their betrayals. Some would hang, others would lose lands or titles. Some would be allowed to swear fealty anew. It was a grim task, but John undertook it with a sense of finality. By the time the pale sun rose over Winterfell's walls, he stood on the battlements, gazing out over the white fields. Smoke curled from the chimneys below, and the battered banners of House Stark now flew from the towers. Men shuffled through the gates, carrying bodies to be buried. Some were built into pyres, for the ground was frozen solid. John's breath lingered on the air. This was a new dawn, but it brought him little comfort. The guilt of leaving the Watch, the cost in lives lost during the assault, the knowledge of the wars yet to come weighed on him. Still, he allowed himself one brief moment of satisfaction. The North was free of Bolton rule. The castle of his childhood was back in Stark hands. Robb's last will had not been ignored. Footsteps crunched behind him. He turned to find Alice Karstark, her face weary yet hopeful. She bowed her head. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I wanted to tell you that riders have been sent to White Harbor and to the smaller houses that remain hesitant. The news of our victory will reach them soon. Many will come to bend the knee, or at least to treat with you." John nodded, a tightness in his chest. "Good. The sooner we gather the North, the sooner we can prepare for all that's out there." He glanced to the north, beyond the horizon where the wall stood, where a far deadlier enemy waited. Alice touched his arm gently, understanding. "The Boltons are done," she said. "We will stand with you now against whatever threats remain." In that moment, John felt the presence of the old gods, as though the weirwood trees were watching with silent approval or silent warning. He dipped his head to Alice. "Thank you, my lady. We have much to do. Winter is here, and the war is not ended." She nodded and withdrew, leaving John alone with his thoughts. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of pine and ash. John let his eyes drift over the rebuilt ramparts, the towers. He remembered running across these walls as a child, trying to keep up with Robb, Theon, and the others. Now he stood as the king in the north, named so by a dead brother's will. The path ahead was steep and fraught with peril. Political battles with the crown, the threat of the others, the mistrust of certain lords. Yet for all that, Jon felt something that had long been absent from his life. Purpose that aligned both his oath-bound sense of duty and the legacy he carried in his blood. A raven called overhead, cutting through the hush. Jon looked up, shading his eyes from the weak sunlight. The black bird circled once, then flew on, vanishing beyond the walls, perhaps heading south with news of Winterfell's liberation. He wondered how the Lannisters would react in King's Landing. He thought of Tyrion, that unlikely friend. Would Tyrion counsel caution? Or would the Iron Throne strike swiftly to crush rebellion? A cold certainty settled in Jon's heart. War with the South was inevitable unless they could be convinced that the North was not a province to be trampled. Then again, if the realm truly grasped the menace of the others, perhaps alliances could be forged. But that was a dream, and Jon had learned that dreams often shattered against the cruelty of reality. Still, he clung to a hope that uniting the North under his rule might be the first step toward uniting all of Westeros against the Night. He believed, or at least wanted to believe, that Ned Stark's honor, Robb Stark's sacrifice, and his own convictions could guide the realm away from ruin. He placed his hand on the cold stone of the battlement, letting the chill seep into his palm. "I will not fail them," he whispered, almost as if speaking to the ghosts of his family. "I will not fail the North. We stand together as wolves, and we will endure the winter." Beyond the walls, the snow-laden trees whispered their agreement, and somewhere in the distance, a lonely wolf howled. The sun rose higher, pale and uncertain, but it was a dawn nonetheless. For the first time in many moons, Winterfell belonged to the Starks again. And Jon Snow, no, Jon Stark, king in the North, stood ready to defend it with everything he had, forging a new path that bent his old vows to the unspoken oath that Ned Stark had always embodied. Protect your home, protect your people, no matter the cost. The words of House Stark rang through his mind, as true as the biting wind. Winter is coming, and Jon would face it, crowned in the memory of a brother's will, robed in the loyalty of a people who needed a king, and armed with the unwavering love for a family he would never forsake again.